Okay, here we go. We'll be quick. Larry Hurtado's book, it's a common sense look at the first centuries of the history of Christianity. He seeks to address blind spots in contemporary academic theories on the origin of Christianity. The foundation of many of these theories rests on a faulty assumption that his book seeks to address. In his preface, he describes this assumption when he says, among both the scholarly guild and the wider public, there is a widespread presumption that all religion is basically the same with insignificant variations of belief and practices, but essentially fitting one conceptual box. Now, his assumption is different. He assumes that Christianity is different. It's right there in the longer title of his book, which says, Destroyer of the Gods, Early Christian Distinctiveness in the Roman World. It highlights the importance of this decisive difference. And I would say that this is part of the reason why this book is useful for today. There is an argument today that maybe as for Christianity to be more approachable, we should try to match our culture more. Not just in presentation, but actually in content. So the idea is that some of our ideas are out of step with the culture today, so maybe we should just get in step. And his argument here is it's the distinctiveness of Christianity that really won out. So now for Horatio's view, it's very, very simplistic, very simple, but I would argue it rings true in that simplicity. What he says essentially is that Christianity is different, and his evidence is for it, as the internal writings say that it's different. The external writings, the contemporaries, those outside the church, describe Christianity as different, and the Christians, the early Christians, are treated different by the Roman Empire. And more than that, what the early Christians do to the world is unique. So all of this unique outcomes would suggest that there's some different uniqueness. However, if you were to hold that all religions are essentially the same, just with some sort of stylistic differences, then you'd have to dismiss all of these evidences as well. You would have to look at history and say that even though Christians describe them as different, and those looking outside of the Christians looking from the outside say that they're different, but even though they say they're different, they're not. You'd also have to hold that even though that there seems to be unique persecution on the Christians, that persecution does not happen because they are different. It just happens. They have a different outcome again for just because. Or you'd have to say that the historic evidence of the change of the Roman Empire as the effect of Christianity, somehow they had different outcomes, even though they're essentially the same as everybody else. The fact that several groups claim to be followers of Christ, even at this period, I should address that now. I keep using words like the church, early church, the Christians. I'm going to continue to use that, but what I really mean with this broader term is I mean the group that Hurtado labels as proto-Christian or proto-Orthodox or proto-Catholic Christians. This group he characterizes by, this is what he says, characterized by broadly by the readiness to recognize one another despite their differences, that would be Catholic, by a high regard for tradition and a suspicion of radical innovations, that means not Gnostic, by a commitment to the Old Testament writings as scripture, and by an exclusive monotheistic stance in which the deity of the Old Testament is the only valid deity worthy of worship. I think that's a good definition to go forward with. Kind of a big tent for Christians. I would add that contained within this idea is that they're not lukewarm. In other words, their belief has to drive what they're doing. And the other one is that they're not syncretic. They're not going along to get along. Because you're going to notice that all of these differences that you see that are described is the fact that they're not participating, that they're seeing some of these other community involvement things as idolatry, and they're stepping out unlike other groups. So moving on to chapter 1, which is titled Early Christianity and Christians and the Christianity in the Eyes of the Non-Christian, he points out in this chapter that the outsiders refer to Christians, this is a quote from him, different, odd, and even objectionable. And this continues on. Later on, he shows that they characterize them even as dangerous, subversive and dangerous. But he starts out first with kind of a near analog, which would be the Jewish community. And he looks at how the Jewish community viewed Christians. It said that and the way that he does this, he starts out talking with Paul, about Paul and Saul. I think this is great because this is a way to show the writings both on the inside and on the outside of the church about this. And we see that Paul himself describes his hatred and rejection for the Jews. Hurtado also makes this inspired link where he kind of hints at one of the reasons is that Jesus was hung on a tree, and in Jewish thought, to be hung on a tree was to be accursed according to the Torah. So I love that. But the question then, as you look at all this and you look at the interplay that happens throughout the Acts narrative, the question is, well, are we looking at a religious or a sectarian civil war or something else? And what we can look on is by moving on to the pagan writers, we can see that it's not just the Jews that are having problems with Christian distinctiveness. It's the pagan world as well. It starts out with Tacitus's often quoted mentioning of Nero's persecution of the Christians. He also shows out the Tacitus's quote that suggests that Christians were engaged in orgiastic sex, incest, and cannibalism. For us, from inside the church, we look at this and go, oh, I know what they're talking about. No, that's not what we're doing. Cannibalism, it's the Lord's Supper. We eat the body and the blood of Christ, but it's, we're not... There you go. It's not cannibalism. And the other one is we have this tendency of calling everybody a brother and sister in Christ, even if it's our husband or wife. That sounds like incest. The other one is this whole idea that we get together for the agape feast, the love feast church. They would thought that we literally did the orgy. I think that's comical, but it shows that there's even early on there's this struggle of trying to see what's going on with the church because somehow there's a differentness to it. One of Tacitus's friends, Pliny the Younger, said of Christians, he just describes kind of a relatively mild thing. He says they meet on a certain fixed day. They chant a hymn to Christ as to their God. They also took an oath to committing themselves to upright behavior, and then later in the day they met to share ordinary and harmless food. He's confused as to all of this because that seems very normal. That's not the problem. It's not meeting and believing. The problem is the exclusivity of Christ. If you look down, he's like, he doesn't understand. Later on, it quotes about how the confusion that these guys are willing to die for their faith, even if they're, all they have to do is recant and they'd be letting go. But they're steadfast, as he says, the steadfast refusal despite threats. He had to either order their execution or if they're to send out for further trial. He was confused by this. See, here's the risk, is that the Christians, as they were withdrawing from worship of the other gods and sacrificing because they viewed all of that idolatry, they were kind of set apart from all of the other religious groups. The even Jews maybe were sometimes labeled atheist or because they pull away from this, but Jews, they were ethnically peculiar. They were isolated, as his quote is ethnically peculiar. But I would say that for Christianity, the challenge is the Great Commission suggests that they should go and make disciples of all nations, which would give them a problem. It means that they're infectious. Christianity was at one point, and this is kind of Galen's opinion, is that they're kind of regarded well for their views on things like valor and temperance and justice. But one of the things he has a problem with them, and he says, is their philosophical, and this is his quote, philosophical reasoning, that they have a, Galen says, insufficient reliant upon philosophical reading and too much based on claims about divine revelation. His problem, so Galen's basic problem is that they believe their Bible, and his problem is that they don't listen to reason. They don't listen to non-biblical reason. It's interesting, I read the same accusation of evangelicals. Somebody said that's the problem with evangelicals is they have too little view of reason and too high view of the Bible. Politically, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, he calls these early Christians, bloody-minded because they refuse to leave Christ, and because of that, they die. Playwright Lucian, he kind of describes Christians as kind of rubes, right? I mean, that's kind of their problem. He looks at them and says, these guys easily duped. That's kind of his thought. Moving on, Celsius. Now Celsius is interesting because he actually he digs into Christian writings, and Horatio points out that he does research for his thing to make this argument, and this suggests that by his point, the problem is that Christianities are, and this is quoting him. He says, beginning to make converts from the wrong social classes. Philosophers are starting to become Christians, so he has to figure out what to do. Now, at this point, there is a restatement of that belief, the suggested growth of the church that suggested. This was Rodney Stark's suggested numbers. He suggested about 10,000 Christians in 100 AD, 200,000 by 200 AD, 6 million, 5 to 6 million by 300 AD. I think this is woefully underrepresented. And part of the reason I do is just looking at that first little thing is way off. So if you follow the narrative of the Bible, you're looking at probably 10,000 Christians within the first few weeks of Pentecost. So to suggest that there's zero growth of the church from 35-ish AD to 100 AD seems unlikely, especially when that's when the Bible's written, especially when that's when Paul does all of his missionary journeys. So I think those numbers are wrong and highly suspect. Continuing on, though. There's this idea that, and ultimately how he kind of wraps everything up is he says, hey, this pagan suspicion against Christians surfaced, this is a quote, found expression in savage attacks and sarcastic remarks. Furthermore, it grows into persecution, it grows into all of this. And the other question that he throws out here, and I think this is a valid one, is he says, there's a curious gap in recent scholarship as to the origins of Christianity and an adequate treatment of what makes early converts think it is worth those costs. His point is the church, wherever it exploded, when it exploded under persecution. And somehow there's a differentness, not only a differentness that caused their persecution, but a differentness that the outside world recognized so much that they thought that risking persecution to gain it, differentness is worth it. I will close with this thought. I think this is a good, not only a lesson about early Christianity, but about Christianity today. The reality is we don't need to water down our message. Now, maybe there's always a good reason to analyze whether or not we're speaking the right language to the people, but we should never modify the message. And it's the Christian distinctiveness that is the center of the hope that we're offering the world. Thank you very much. Have a great day.